Last summer at my parents' lake house, the sentence tastes like warm cedar and engine oil in my mouth. Hi everyone, my name is Logan Franklin. The house sat at the edge of the water like a well-polished promise. Sunlight skated across the lake in thin silver blades, but inside me everything felt dim, carefully packed away so no one could see it. I was the quiet worker in a family that worshipped sparkle. I fixed the dock, balanced their bills at 2 a.m., patched the roof after storms and kept the place breathing. My sister floated through life in soft linen dresses, laughing as if effort were something poor people invented. That afternoon, Mom handed me their travel brochure like it was a gift. Santorini, White Cliffs, private yachts, sunset dinners. Dad clapped my shoulder and said, "You're doing so well, son. You'll cover it, right?" I looked at the numbers I'd already paid for them. Property tax, credit cards, utilities, repairs. My bank app glowed cold in my palm. I nodded anyway. That night, the lake hummed like a low heartbeat. I sat alone at the end of the dock, dangling my feet over black water that reflected nothing back to me. The transfer button waited on my screen, gentle, final, irreversible. Wind moved through the pines like distant applause. For the first time, I didn't ask what my parents needed. I asked what I had left. And that silence stretched wider than the lake. Morning arrived without softness, just pale light leaking through the blinds and the sharp smell of lake water carried on the breeze. I found my mother already awake, standing at the kitchen island in a silk robe, scrolling through her phone like the world existed only inside that glowing rectangle. Coffee steamed in a porcelain cup that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. "Did you send it?" she asked without looking at me. The question landed like glass on tile. I poured myself coffee, too bitter, too hot, and watched my reflection wobble in the dark surface. My hands smelled faintly of pine from last night's repairs. Hers smelled like lavender and money. Dad appeared a moment later, tan blazer draped over his arm though it was barely 8 a.m. He talked about boarding passes, upgrades, private drivers, all of it casual, inevitable, already owned. I told them I needed more time. The room went quiet in a way that felt intentional. Mom finally turned. Her eyes weren't angry, they were distant as if I'd drifted out of frame. "Don't make this difficult, Logan. Family supports family." My sister breezed in, kissed the air near my cheek and asked if I could drive her to town later. She didn't ask how I was. I swallowed, smiled and said yes. When they stepped outside, I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the house settle. The fridge hummed. A clock ticked. The lake glittered through the window like a polished lie. On my phone, the pending transfer blinked. Processing, awaiting confirmation. My thumb hovered. Somewhere a boat engine roared to life across the water. Loud, confident, moving forward without hesitation. I realized I had been their engine for years. And engines, when they stop, don't warn anyone first. By noon the lake turned glassy, so still it felt staged, like a painting pretending to be weather. I drove my sister into town with the windows down. Radio low, wind sharp, tires whispering over gravel. She talked about boutiques, sunset dinners and how travel clears the soul, as if money were a spiritual practice. At the marina, I caught my reflection in the fuel pump's chrome, older than I felt, thinner than I wanted to admit. My hands still smelled like oil and damp rope. She leaned against my truck, scrolling, barely noticing when I filled the tank for the family boat with my card. Back at the house, the backyard had transformed into a rehearsal for their trip. White linens, silver trays, champagne sweating in buckets of ice. Mom called it a bon voyage gathering, though no one bothered to invite me properly. Dad pressed a glass into my hand. "Smile," he said. "This is a celebration." I tried. Cracked. Neighbors praised my parents' success. Friends gushed over my sister's lifestyle. I drifted through it all like a well-trained ghost, visible only when they needed something lifted, fixed, or paid. When the sun dipped, I slipped away to the dock. The water mirrored the orange sky so perfectly it felt dangerous. My phone buzzed again, transfer still pending. Confirm? A dragonfly landed on my knuckle, weightless, temporary, unafraid. I thought about how easily things could rest on me, and how rarely anyone noticed. The party's laughter floated across the yard behind me, bright and careless. I looked at that glowing button one last time. And realized, tonight I would choose which version of myself stayed afloat. The party peaked just as the sun collapsed into the lake. Lanterns glowed like captive fireflies across the yard, and the air tasted like grilled citrus, smoke and expensive perfume. Music drifted from hidden speakers, polished and pleasant, exactly like my parents. I stood near the stone fire pit, pretending to be occupied with a log that didn't need fixing. My sister laughed too loudly at something I hadn't said, then wrapped her arm around Mom as if staking territory. Dad called for attention and raised his glass. To family, he said, eyes sliding past me. To travel, to success, and to those who make it possible. People turned toward me, briefly, politely, like I was part of the scenery. My mother leaned close. You still haven't confirmed the transfer, she whispered, warm breath carrying an edge I'd never heard before. I met her eyes. They weren't soft anymore. They were expectant. I excused myself to the dock. Night had settled so completely that the water looked like black satin. Crickets buzzed in the reeds. Somewhere across the lake, a porch light blinked on like a distant heartbeat. I opened my phone. The screen glowed bright enough to hurt. Confirm payment? My thumb hovered again, but this time my hand didn't tremble. I thought of every late night I'd balanced their world alone. Every "you're so reliable," that meant "don't change." Every time my sister's ease eclipsed my effort. Wind moved through the pines, carrying laughter from the yard. I let the silence stretch until it felt intentional. Then I slid my thumb, not to confirm but to cancel. The notification vanished like a breath in cold air. Behind me music swelled. In front of me the lake stayed perfectly still, waiting to see who I would become. The moment I stepped back onto the lawn, the mood had sharpened. Strings of lantern light trembled in a sudden breeze, and somewhere a speaker popped, small, almost accidental, but it felt symbolic. Guests clustered around the long table, laughter thinning into curious murmurs. My mother found me first. Her smile was still painted on, but it sat wrong like a mask slipping. She held her phone low, screen angled toward me. The payment didn't go through, she said quietly. Not a question, a verdict. I took a breath that tasted like smoke and lemon. I paused it, I replied. My sister laughed before she understood. Then she did understand, and her face cooled in a single beat. You're joking, she said, swirling champagne she'd barely touched. Tell him you're joking. Dad joined us, jaw tight, blazer folded over his arm like a shield he didn't know how to use. Logan, he began in that careful voice he used only when control felt slippery. This isn't the night for experiments. Around us the party kept moving, clinking glasses, cutting cake, clicking cameras, but our circle felt sealed off, airless. I told them I wasn't angry. I told them I was tired. My mother reached for my wrist the way you reach for a child about to step into traffic. I gently pulled free. Across the yard, Grandma watched from her chair near the fire pit, wrapped in a pale blue shawl. Her eyes were clear, unblinking, reading the room like a quiet storm. Music shifted to something slower. The lake darkened behind the house, swallowing the last strip of sunset. For the first time all night, I felt the ground under my feet, solid, undeniable, mine. And in that stillness, I realized the party was no longer theirs to steer. Dinner was served like nothing had happened. White plates, silver cutlery, perfect napkins folded into triangles that looked too stiff to touch. Waiters moved quietly through the lantern glow, as if politeness alone could hold the evening together. I sat near the end of the table, exactly where I always sat, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be forgotten. My parents whispered to each other over their wine. My sister laughed too brightly at a joke no one told. The rhythm of the party felt off now, like music played a half step too fast. Halfway through the meal my phone buzzed. A bank alert. Not a demand. Not a reminder. Just a record, the cancellation fully processed. I set the phone face down and kept eating. Across the fire pit, Grandma rose slowly from her chair. Wood cracked beneath her shoes, and for a moment the entire yard seemed to lean toward her. She moved without urgency, but with a gravity that pulled the air behind her. She stopped beside my mother. For a long second no one spoke. Then she reached into her shawl pocket and placed a folded envelope on the table between my parents' plates. Neat, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Dad frowned. Mom stilled. Grandma looked at me, then back at them. I didn't raise you to confuse generosity with entitlement, she said, voice soft but ironed flat. The chatter around us died in pieces. Forks paused midair. Glasses hovered. Lantern light trembled against stunned faces. My sister scoffed under her breath, but even she didn't dare speak. I felt something loosen in my chest, not triumph, not relief, but something deeper, alignment. The lake behind the house breathed in once, slow and wide. And as my parents stared at that quiet envelope, I understood that truth, when it arrives, doesn't need volume, only timing. The envelope sat there like a small, patient verdict. No theatrics. No raised voices. Just white paper against white linen, a contrast so simple it felt surgical. My father finally picked it up. His fingers trembled in a way I'd never seen before, not even during storms or bad markets. Mom leaned in close, perfume sharp, breath shallow. My sister tilted her head like she was trying to decode a puzzle that inconvenienced her. Grandma returned to her chair, slow and steady, as if she'd simply moved a piece on a chessboard and was now waiting for the consequences to unfold. Dad unfolded the letter. Lantern light slid across his face. Confusion, then disbelief, then something like shame trying to find oxygen. Mom read over his shoulder, lips pressing thin, color draining from her cheeks. The guests pretended to look elsewhere, but every ear leaned toward our table. I didn't move. I didn't gloat. I simply watched my parents realize that the lake house, the land, the dock, the very life they treated as inheritance, was legally tied to conditions they had long ignored: respect, reciprocity, and the promise that the family would never exploit the one person keeping it afloat. My sister laughed once, brittle, then stopped when no one joined her. Wind threaded through the pines again, carrying the smell of water and smoke. Grandma met my eyes across the yard and gave the smallest nod, not proud, not pitying, just clear. In that moment, I understood something painful and quiet. Families don't break all at once. They loosen thread by thread. And tonight, one very old thread had finally slipped free. Silence settled over the table like fresh snow, beautiful, dangerous, impossible to pretend wasn't there. The waiters froze mid-step. Lanterns swayed. The lake breathed in the dark behind us, wide and patient, as if it had been waiting years for this exact hour. My father lowered the letter slowly, both hands now resting flat on the tablecloth, palms pressed into a life that suddenly felt less certain. My mother folded her napkin, not neatly, just tightly, like she was trying to contain something unraveling inside her. My sister stared at me across the table, eyes searching for betrayal, then power, then apology, and finding none of them. Only calm. Grandma rose once more, this time carrying no envelope, no lesson, only a small glass of water. She placed it gently beside me. For the work you've carried quietly, she said. Not the show you were never given. No one clapped. No one protested. The party didn't explode. It simply softened, the edges of everything becoming real instead of polished. I walked to the dock alone. Moonlight stitched silver paths across the lake, steady and unbroken. I sat where I'd sat the night before, but the reflection beneath me was different now, clearer, steadier, recognizable. My phone buzzed in my pocket, full of messages I didn't open. Behind me, voices murmured, rearranging themselves around a truth they could no longer dodge. I didn't leave angry. I didn't leave victorious. I left aligned, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with money. The lake held me without asking for payment. And for the first time, so did my family.